Thank you. As you know, the theme of today's event is the new energy, and we're hearing a lot about the importance of shifting away from fossil fuels, which is absolutely essential. But what I want to do today is provide an asterisk to this discussion, because I believe that our energy challenges demand far more than just alternate energy solutions and increased efficiency. As Melissa mentioned, as a documentary filmmaker working on environmental issues in British Columbia, I get a chance to interview some leading thinkers on these matters. And in a little bit, I'll play up here some clips that I've shot over the last several years documenting some of the ecological trade-offs of one type of so-called clean tech energy being developed here in British Columbia. It was Albert Einstein who said, "We can't solve the problems by using the same sort of thinking we used when we created them." And the spirit of that thought runs through every aspect of my argument today. Whether it's putting corporations in charge of cleaning up the mess they created, or deluding ourselves that we can continue consuming similar amounts of energy and natural resources without changing our lifestyles. Basically, we need to change the way, fundamentally change the way we think if we're going to deal with these issues. The big challenges of our time, climate change, peak oil, food security issues, all relate back to how we use energy. What sources power our lifestyles and economy, and how much, and that's a very important part, how much of them we use. To meet our energy challenges, well, I should actually first say that I believe that really I loosely characterize two different types of schools of thought that have evolved to address these energy challenges. The first being what I call the Techno-Fix culture, the other being the conservation culture. And again, this is an oversimplification, but the former assures us that advances in technology, powered largely by market innovation, will more or less fill in the gaps from shifting away from our dependence on fossil fuels. While the latter warns us that nothing short of a major shift in our consumerist lifestyles and energy-intensive, growth-oriented, globalized economy will begin to solve these challenges. I locate myself in the latter camp, but that doesn't mean eschewing alternate energy by any means or efficiency. It's all about where you put your focus. And I believe that we do need a combination of three solutions to adequately address our energy challenges. The first being non-fossil fuel-based energy, also vastly improved energy efficiency across the board, but most importantly, and we can't do it without this, an overall reduction in the total amount of energy that we use through serious conservation efforts. I'm going to begin with addressing the problem associated with dealing with energy efficiency alone. And this is best summarized in a recent book called Why Your World is About to Get a Whole Lot Smaller by Jeff Rubin, which many of you will be familiar with. Basically, what Jeff Rubin describes in his book, he uses an example, the OPEC-initiated oil embargo of the 1970s. Whereby United States and other Western countries enacted much stronger fuel economy standards in response to the shutting off of oil supplies from the Middle East. The problem is that this actually ended up backfiring. What happened was it decreased demand, resulted in a lowering of energy costs, which ultimately encouraged more energy consumption and related carbon emissions. He gives the example essentially of car makers who, instead of making smaller vehicles that required less energy, ultimately used these technological advances to build bigger vehicles that used the same amount of fuel, and ultimately they found that they could move them faster. And so we go from the 1.2-liter Corolla in the 1970s to the 6-liter family SUV today. Meanwhile, there are 130 million more cars on American roads today than there were in 1970, all of them driving greater distances. And so we get this energy efficiency paradox. The same pattern repeats itself throughout society. We attempt to deal with traffic congestion by widening a highway, which has the initial benefit of reducing congestion, but ultimately encourages more urban sprawl type development and more drivers to use the highway. And before you know it, you have twice as many cars on the road spending just as long sitting in gridlock. And of course, there's twice as many carbon emissions associated with that. We see. I had the opportunity to listen to a major Canadian retailer making a pitch to city council about, and making the ironic boast that their 160,000 square foot car-dependent coal-fired Chinese factory-powered, global shipping system dependent store would somehow be LEED Gold certified for energy efficiency. Meanwhile, the average home size in North America has ballooned from 900 square feet in 1970 to over 2,300 square feet today, each filled with more stuff traveling greater distances. And now imagine this system repeated on a larger scale in emerging economies, as we heard, places like Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And you start to get a sense of what we're dealing with here. Focusing on alternate energy and techno-fixes alone isn't going to solve our problems either. I'm sorry to break this to you, those who think that the Prius and windmills are going to save us. I beg to differ. All of these types of alternate energy, with the exception of conservation, carry significant ecological consequences with them. The materials required for windmills and electric vehicles create pollution in the places that they're mined. In the United States, half of the power for that electric car comes from dirty coal today. Wind farms create impacts as well, such as on bats, and then you have the deforestation for these long transmission corridors. Even solar panels and photovoltaic cells require energy and raw materials to manufacture, and the components are shipped around the world largely on fossil fuels. We're seeing a growing trend of decommissioning large hydro dams to help to remediate some of the tremendous ecological impacts we've seen over the years. And natural gas is termed as a clean fuel, but when you start to look at all the different costs ecologically and carbon-wise in the process of extracting these things, especially in the era of natural gas fracking that we're seeing today, I think you can hardly term that a clean energy source. Biofuels, when we talk about biofuels, we're essentially trading precious food security for a negligible, if any, reduction in carbon emissions. And then here in British Columbia today, we're dealing with what I term a liquid gold rush on BC's rivers, led by the likes of General Electric, who are coming here to build massive private river diversion projects. There's an example of one under construction a few years ago. True, and these are mischaracterized, I should note, as run-of-river or small hydro projects. True run-of-river is genuinely small and is used in places like Vietnam, as an example here, to get villages off of diesel power. Typically involves a several-inch wide pipe diverting a small amount of the river for a short distance, putting it through a turbine or a pellet wheel, and back into the river largely undisturbed. By contrast, these mega projects in British Columbia are on a scale of magnitude, sometimes 1,000 times what we're talking about for true small hydro. The first image you're going to see in a second here is an interactive map that pinpoints the 700 projects that are either proposed, in construction, or already up and running in British Columbia. None of these have been evaluated based on their cumulative impacts. These are some of the special places that people in British Columbia have mobilized to protect that are threatened by these projects. And these rivers and streams are the lifeblood of BC's ecologies. They provide the moisture and the nutrients that enable two major temperate rainforests to flourish here. They're home to diverse and often threatened fish and wildlife populations. And this brings up another point. We need to stop thinking in terms of carbon and climate and more about ecology. Even the International Panel on Climate Change tells us that one of the best things we can do to fight climate change is to protect old-growth forests and biodiversity around the world. Here's an example of some of the impacts. That's an example of one of the several meter-wide pipes and tunnels that are typically used to divert over 90% of the mean annual flow of these rivers compared to the 10% of a typical run-of-river project, leaving just a tiny trickle in the river. Here's an example of one project there. There's the 90% coming out of the other end of the pipe. You have large work camps like this, for example, where the workers are often flowing back and forth from across the country, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off type shifts. You have materials that are brought in from all around the world, machines that toil for years, diesel-powered machines spewing carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Large amounts of blasting and logging are required to punch through these transmission corridors and roads and the head pond area that stores the water at the top of these projects, building industrial bridges, etc. We have a paltry environmental assessment process that includes zero genuine public consultation. Many of these projects are under a threshold for which they have no genuine environmental assessment. We also, and this is the most important thing, there's no coupling of bringing these new projects online with the reduction of other fossil fuel plants in our neighboring jurisdictions. And that's the most important thing. What we're doing here is we're piling ecologically destructive new power on top of existing fossil fuel systems. And that's not helping our overall situation. So what I'm going to do in a second, we'll go back to the, focus back to the PowerPoint here. Oh, actually, for one last thing. This is the Butte Inlet, which is BC's longest fjord. This is where General Electric wants to build the largest private hydropower project in Canadian history. There's a model that shows some of the transmission lines and roads and pipes and all the things involved in this. A staggering 17 different rivers that would be dammed and diverted. Over 450 kilometers of transmission lines plowed through wilderness. 250 kilometers of large-scale industrial roads and over 100 industrial bridges, among many different impacts. This isn't small hydro, and it's certainly not green unless you consider the $20 billion estimated contract that BC Hydro would get from the people of British Columbia to operate this project over 40 years. This is a quote from Dr. Bill Rees, who is a professor at the University of British Columbia and the founder of the eco-footprint concept, and this is what he has to say about these private river power projects in British Columbia. As I close this discussion here, how about some new thinking? Because this, again, I would submit is more of the same thinking, as Einstein said, that's gotten us into this mess. So how about some new thinking to deal with our challenges here? I would say the first thing is that we need to put conservation first. Our public power utility in BC, BC Hydro, tells us that we could save enough energy to meet roughly a third of our total present electrical needs simply through conservation if we got serious about it. Public power utilities are also ideally positioned to drive conservation because they don't have to worry about selling more power and driving shareholder profits. They can focus on these bigger concerns. We also need to heed the exhortation of people like Jeff Rubin that say we need to relocalize everything from manufacturing to food production. We waste tremendous amounts of energy today shipping raw materials halfway around the world to be fashioned into finished goods and shipped all the way back again. Some of the speakers before have made some great points about the kind of small-scale, local alternate energy solutions we need to be focusing on. When you build one of these big behemoth projects off in the wilderness, those transmission lines lose significant amounts of that power in transmission through electromagnetic radiation, which makes them tremendously inefficient, aside from all the ecological impacts they have. So small-scale things like wind and solar tied into battery systems, ground source heat pumps, solar hot water tanks, some of the passive design elements that have been mentioned before, geothermal in places where it makes sense geographically, these sorts of things definitely make sense. Above all, we need to stop subsidizing fossil fuels. We need to put our investment into alternate energy sources and into public transit instead of building more car-dependent highway systems. And finally, the most important new idea that isn't new at all. It's returning to a simpler, more fulfilling way of life, much like our grandparents who made do, as you can see by these comparisons, with much less and I think lived happy, fulfilling lives in spite of it. We want to kid ourselves that somehow we can endless growth on a finite planet is possible and that technology, enterprise, and market solutions can solve our problems, when in fact they often are the problem. What's required here is a broad-based consciousness shift on the part of the public and policymakers that recognizes we need to fundamentally change the way we use and abuse energy. I fully believe, in spite of the challenges that we face, that it's within our power to do these things, but we've got to start getting serious about them now. Thank you very much.